able to see the title, hopefully. Welcome
Yes.
to everybody who's joining us. I can see that we have some attendees coming in. Welcome to the first Heart to Heart of the year. Lovely to have you here, and lovely to have you here at a different time as well. Thank you for making time in your day. I'm Kyra from WomenEd Spain, and we'll leave a couple of minutes to let people come in and join us, and I'll let Angeline say hi to you all as well.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to our WomenEd Heart to Heart that's sponsored by ECIS. And we would like you to also get to know you. So please, into the chat, make sure you click on all panelists and attendees. And if you'd like to just introduce yourself and where you're joining us from, that would be great. So thank you so much. And I see quite a lot of familiar names joining us today for people who've been to our previous heart-to-heart conversations. So thank you for your trust in us and for joining us each time.
Good, just checking the chat works. Hi, Juliet. Nice to have you here.
Yeah, so Juliet's also from WomenEd Netherlands, and I am a part of WomenEd Germany.
Wow, so we have someone here from Korea. Nice to see you here, Courtney. International School of Paris, awesome. Quite a lot of Dutch representation here today. That's great. Hi, Michelle. Nice to see you. Nice to see you back.
Thank you for joining us from all around the globe. If you've just joined, make sure you introduce yourself in the chat, tell us who you are and where you're joining us from, and I'd like to welcome you to our first Heart to Heart for 2021.
Great, so we've got representation from Italy, the Netherlands, London, Korea. I think I saw, well, obviously Spain and Germany. British Columbia is where Tricia's calling in from. Okay. So, shall we get started?
Yes, let's.
Awesome. Okay, so welcome everybody to the first in the annual series of WomenEd ECIS collaborative heart-to-heart talks. We're really, really happy to have two incredible guests who've been working in diversity and equality and inclusion for several years, and we will introduce them and their backgrounds as far as this special feature on intersectionality that we're going to be running today. But before that, we like to just explain a little bit about the collaboration and how this series of talks came about. So I'll pass over to Angeline, who always does this slide because she likes talking about the community.
Yeah, so just a little bit of background about WomenEd. WomenEd is a grassroots organization it's a volunteer nonprofit, and we started as a hashtag on Twitter, starting in the UK, and then has just expanded globally. So there's WomenEd Canada also, where Tricia is, and it's growing all the time with new communities happening. And so when we couldn't have our in-person live face-to-face events due to the pandemic, I from WomenEd Germany hooked up with Kyra from WomenEd Spain, and we started these offerings of these heart-to-heart conversations as a way of bringing the WomenEd community together. And in support of women in education, ECIS has started a new special interest group with that, and also sponsored an international series of our WomenEd heart-to-heart conversations. So thank you very much for your support on that, ECIS. So over to you again, Kyra.
Okay, so a few housekeeping notes. Some of you already have joined us, but just know that this is a webinar, so that we are not able to engage and hear you. So we'd love it if you use the chat to interact and post any burning comments or questions. We will be watching them throughout and relaying those at appropriate times to Sadie and Tricia to discuss. Please make sure you're speaking to all of us. It's really easy to just talk to the panelists, so make sure you've selected panelists and attendees when you're typing. We won't be using raise your hand feature, which I don't think is available on this version of Zoom at the moment anyway, but the session is recorded, and if anyone you know wants to make it but couldn't because the timing is tricky, there will be a video shared through the WomenEd YouTube, and we will be posting this on Twitter after the event as well. We love it when we have live mentions and comments and we can keep the discussion going on Twitter. So we've shared everybody's hashtags here and links to use them as you wish. If you want to continue talking to Tricia_Fried or at Wise Education, you can continue to talk to Sadie and Tricia after the event as well. And of course, mention WomenEd Heart to Heart if you want to connect to the other conversations that we've had in past series sessions as well. Sorry, I've got slippery butterfingers this morning with my slide movement. So without no further ado, I'd like to introduce Tricia Friedman, first of all, one of our panelists for today. She's joining us, as she already told you, from British Columbia. So thank you for making the time early on for you as well. Tricia has over 20 years experience in education. She's held roles as classroom teacher, service learning leader, and instructional coach. She was a former youth development volunteer in the Peace Corps and describes herself as a proud queer educator. And Tricia has an excellent newsletter and podcast that I subscribe to called the Be a Better Ally. Tricia's podcast has been podcasting a long time and has been an impressive host. But she's very, very well respected and already known, I think, in the area. So we're very, very happy to have her join us and to lend some of her insights today. And of course, there is her Twitter hashtag, her Twitter handle, if you would like to connect with Tricia and get to know her a bit better. And Tricia will be saying hello in a moment and telling us a bit more about her experiences. And then I'd also like to take the time to welcome Dr. Sadie Hollins. So Sadie is currently head of sixth form at the Lana International School in Thailand. It has many different hats, has worn many different hats, being a former higher education lecturer and researcher. She's focused on sociological issues in sport. And again, somebody who's been incredibly proactive with the creation of a community. So the Wise Education newsletter and blog is her passion project. She's also passionate about discussing all issues relating to well-being. And so we'll be taking this conversation forward into the realm of intersectionality and wellness. And I hope that we'll get to talk about those intersections. Her Twitter handle is _Wise Education. So lovely to meet you both here digitally and also to have you with us. And I know that we'll hear a bit more about your journeys as we move forward. So thank you.
Yes, so WomenEd also has a set of core values and aims that we're trying to achieve. And one of our campaigns is to increase representation in leadership roles. And although WomenEd we're in support of all women in education, we're also focused on assisting aspiring and existing leaders. And this is because we recognize that there is a big gender gap, both in the representation of women in leadership roles and also like things like a pay gap, for example. And so what we've been able to discover with international schools, with data published by institutions like the Council of International Schools by CIS. So for example, in 2018, there was a survey that went out and there was a 23% pay gap between male heads of schools and female counterparts. And then the year after, in 2019, one would hope that this pay gap would be reduced, but it actually increased with a new set of data of their membership schools. And when we were preparing for webinars like this, we're also trying to find information to help inform us. But it's really hard to find data that has been gathered about different intersections of one's own identity. So, for example, for the first time in 2020, CIS actually measured ethnicity this year, and the data shows that there is an even larger pay gap when that is factored in, and so that's really interesting to learn about. And in the next slide, there is one piece of research that I did find. It was called Held Down and Held Back, Systematically Delayed Principal Promotions by Race and Gender. And in this study, they found that race and gender are associated with the probability of promotion to school leadership, and that Black principals are least likely to be promoted, and they wait longer for a promotion when compared to white assistant principals. And in addition to that, the findings also suggest that even though women have over a year more experience on average before they're being promoted to assistant principal, they're also less likely to be promoted to high school principal. And when they are, it is after a fairly long tenure as an assistant principal. So this study was actually done in the States, and so, like I mentioned before, not a lot of people are gathering this data. Although I think that there's been usually the trends that I've seen anyway is like it'll start in the business world where they start to gather this data, and then it starts to permeate into the educational world. And I want to thank Tricia for finding this report here, and maybe I'll hand it over to you, Tricia, to talk about the McKinsey data about LGBTQ plus women.
Oh, sure. Thank you. And thanks again for including me today. For me, again, middle of the morning, I'm really happy to be a part of this great initiative that you're hosting. So the data here from McKinsey really just shows you, as it says, that LGBTQ plus women are underrepresented at every single stage of the management pipeline. This data is not specific to the world of education, but I think, from my lived experience, I would say is true in that space as well. And I also just want to point out, Ange, as you were, that there's a big void of data because when I've been trying to find that data as it applies to schools, I'm just not seeing it. If you've come across that information, please do share it with us, or please do tweet it to me, because I really have tried to overturn every single stone that I can. But I would also just invite you, if you've been working in schools, how many folks would say, I have had a manager, I've had a member of a leadership team identify and be out as, queer identifying. I've not had that ever, and I've worked in 7 different schools. So I just sort of think, again, just asking people, have you ever had that experience? Let me know if you have. I'd love to hear more about that. But the full report from McKinsey is great. So the link is there. I'd invite you just to make sure to keep that and have a look at it later on.
Thank you so much. And so, the main topic of our Heart to Heart today is thinking about that intersectionality. So, as our grounding as WomenEd and women in education, but we can't talk about equity for women in education without thinking about intersectionality. And so I want to also then ask you today, so maybe we'll start with you, Sadie, is thinking about, so what is intersectionality? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, hey everyone, and thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this conversation. Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think it's just all the kind of different parts of our identity that can either advantage or disadvantage us depending on the context that we're in. So whether that's identifying as female, whether that's coming from a working class or a middle class background, race and ethnicity, how does that impact our access to different opportunities and promotions and things like that?
Yeah, and the term, I think, intersectionality itself was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, an American law professor, and in 1989 she talked about intersectional feminism, and I saw in a recent post by UN Women on Instagram, actually. It was explaining that intersectional feminism is like a prism for seeing the way in which various forms of inequality like often operate together and exacerbate each other. And so intersectionality is really centering the voices of those experiencing some overlapping or concurrent forms of oppression in order to understand the depths of the inequalities and the relationships among them in a given context. So it's really the idea that even though we're looking at, say, inequality in general and inequality for women, all inequality is not really created equal. Is that something? What are your thoughts on that, then, Tricia? Would you agree with that?
Yes, and I kind of want to just point, maybe I'm sort of representing my age here, but I also just want to go back to you mentioning, Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term in 1989, and in my brain, it's like, oh, that was just yesterday. But that's some 30 years ago, and I just kind of want to point out it's taken sort of 3 decades for this term to become so-called mainstream and for more conversations to be having around it. So that's kind of part one. But to your question, Ange, I love Kimberly Crenshaw has also said, she gave a talk to NAIS, the National Association for Independent Schools, where she refers to intersectionality as an awareness that our identity is a relationship between people and history. And I really like that because it's that reminder that, identity and our understanding of identity, it's shifting, it's changing, right? It's evolving. So I kind of just want to point that out because conversations that we're having about identity today, hopefully we're going to be in an even better place tomorrow. And I think part of having that mindset of our awareness and our understanding of big concepts like this, they're always shifting, because I think part of what we've seen in terms of the backlash against intersectionality, and sometimes people saying, oh, it's a fad, it's a trend, or it is meant to oppress cis white men. No, it's none of those things. This is the result of, research, of learning, of thinking, of us trying to just become a little bit more evolved in what we're talking about when we're talking about who we are, and our place in society. Sorry, that was a long answer. Again, it's
great.
3:15 in the morning for me, so please feel free to just give me a little hand gesture, or okay, have another sip of your coffee.
No, not at all. No, please don't be worried about that. And I love what you said about it being an awareness of and the identity linked to people and history, and then that we're in a different stage of time, but how unfortunate that decades have passed and nothing's changed, and that there's a backlash towards this. And so I'm just wondering too that what are some maybe common misconceptions that people may have about what intersectionality is? Are there any that perhaps you, Tricia, or Sadie have come across?
Tricia, go for it. Sorry, you look like you were.
Oh, sorry.
You had something lined up.
Again, I have heard folks say that, us thinking about all of this is meant to be trendy, or I have heard, folks say this is about flipping hierarchy and taking power away from cis hetero white men. And again, you mentioned, and Kimberly Crenshaw has said this is a prism for us to look through, and I know that she has mentioned it's a prism that we can look at problems through. It's also a prism that we can look at stories and the way that we tell stories through. So I think, to me, that's kind of the number one misconception that I hear all the time, is that in some, this is about kind of flipping a power dynamic or taking power away, or again, that this is a passing trend. And I think that's the thing that's upsetting, is sometimes when we're having conversations like the one that we're engaged in right now, I will hear people say like, oh, this is a hot topic. And no, this is, an awareness. This is a much greater awareness of what it means to be people together in society. And that's sort of the language that I would like to see just, No, this is not a trend or a fad. This is not, a type of jeans that you're going to see out on the street more often. Like, this is important work, and it's important learning for us to be doing, especially in the world of education.
Yeah, so I just, sorry, just to add to Tricia's point, yeah, absolutely agree. What I think is interesting about intersectionality is I think for a long time I've never had words to kind of put to how I experience it or how I come to understand it. So even like thinking about it now, I'm kind of a little bit lost for words, but I know I live it, and I know I'm starting to kind of unpick, different parts of my identity and how that has impacted me and continues to impact me. So yeah, it's not going away, and it shouldn't. It should be something that we're more better able to engage with, and perhaps better able to verbalize and articulate how that impacts us.
Sadie, I love that you mentioned, it's something that we engage with, because I think that's absolutely spot on right. And if folks are listening and saying, I don't understand, how do we engage with this term? And again, please let me know if this is not what you had in mind, Sadie. But when I think about engaging with it, I think it's a constant asking about one's own privilege. Thank you so much for the kind introduction at the start of this, but I think more and more I've been thinking about some of the success that I've been able to experience as an educator, and really reckoning with the fact that I am white. I come from the US, which again, when we're talking about privilege and the current state of politics, I know that feels strange to bring up, but that passport has a lot of power. I am able-bodied, I am neurotypical. And I think for a long time, I wasn't understanding why in an interview context do I have a significantly easier time than other folks, even though I'm queer. So again, just engaging with the term and really thinking about privilege and having that be kind of a usualized activity for all of us, I think is incredibly important.
Yes, and I think that leads us to some of the comments that are coming in, which I would like to make sure you've engaged with. Is that Deborah thanks you, Tricia, for using the word evolved. It's her hope that we're all becoming more aware and involved in embracing all forms of diversity. And I think that the next slide is all about terminology, because as you've both rightly identified, I think there's some confusion and perhaps some tiptoeing around terminology and about what is acceptable, what's the misconception here for those voices that maybe have some resistance to putting this out in the mainstream and making it a key part of our learning as educators. So we'd like to kind of hear from you both on confusion and misconceptions that you've encountered around the differences between talking about sex, talking about gender, talking about sexuality in an educational context. Maybe resistance that you've received or that you've been able to work around, and also how not to tiptoe around it if you don't understand it. Where do you start? And I think it's linked to what you were just talking about unpicking our own biases and understanding our own privilege. But I'd love to hear from both of you on this one. So maybe Sadie, we can start with you.
Sorry, I'm not super forthcoming, but yeah, so I guess like just in terms of my understanding, in terms of like sex being assigned at birth and gender being a construct and it being a continuum, that not a binary one, that either you can kind of place yourself wherever you kind of feel comfortable with, and that may change over time, and then sexuality being who you are attracted to. So I think the thing I've struggled with actually is I think the fear of getting things wrong, right? It makes people avoid the conversation altogether. And so people either just don't give you the space to talk about it, or will put it in, or quickly kind of brush through if it's PSHE, and if people feel super uncomfortable with it, they'll just give you the terminology and then go through and don't really give a chance for students to really explore what these terms mean and their understanding of it. We had quite an interesting development at school this year. We had a trans student come out, and we ended up putting on a training for both for staff actually, and we had the parent of the trans student come in and talk about these terms and actually their experiences and their child's experiences of these terms and what it means to them and how it impacts them. So that really kind of brought life to these terms, because, you know, even as an openly gay woman myself, like I really at times feel hesitant and unsure about getting these terms wrong. But I think that kind of open dialogue was really important.
Yeah, that's great. In your experience, Tricia, have you, I mean, you spend a lot of your time, you know, bringing this discussion into schools, into talking to different actors, I suppose, who meet students and engage with them. What's the most common difficulty you've encountered? Is it similar? Is it just a lack of being open, or is it a sidelining?
Well, you know, I think Sadie touched on it, this idea that we are so afraid of getting it wrong or of saying, you know, the wrong thing that, and again, I feel like if there's any place where we should be really open to, okay, I might not know, so, you know, I'm trying to learn here, that should be in schools, right? Where we have that mindset of, I don't necessarily have the fullest understanding, but I want to learn more. That should be what we're seeing. But I think, unfortunately, what I hear all the time and what I've had folks say directly to me is, I just don't want to say the wrong thing. And so I think there is that real fear. And the other one that I hear all the time is a real resistance, which is also related to fear in terms of, is this age appropriate? And that term, age appropriate, I hear used all the time, you know, to be blunt, as sort of a mask for some homophobia, transphobia, because I think, you know, is talking about sex, gender, and sexuality, our identity, is that age appropriate? How can we ask that question when we also live in a world where, you know, there are lots of little t-shirts for babies that say, you know, like heartbreaker, or, you know, sorry to the panel, I was boring them with this before we got started. I am a new puppy parent. And the number one question that I got asked, you know, when folks found out that I was getting a puppy is it a boy or a girl? So, you know, how crucial folks' understanding or feelings are around gender from such an early age, it's right there. But when we talk about having these conversations with our young learners, I often see folks say, oh, is that age appropriate? And again, that's, of course, talking about who we are, and going back to Kimberly Crenshaw's line, you know, our relationship, intersectionality is our relationship between people and history. Of course, that's age appropriate. And I just kind of think we can do a better job in schools of saying, what is it precisely that you're afraid of in this conversation? Because I do think it goes back to what Sadie mentioned earlier. Folks are afraid they might say the wrong thing. And I kind of think we cannot let that be the reason that we are silent, because I think we have seen the result of silence.
Yes, that's very powerful. Sadie, you look like you want to say something, and then I want to bring up a comment from the audience about culture. But yeah.
Yeah, it was actually, I haven't seen the comment, but that was a kind of a point that I've been thinking about. I teach in a school in Thailand, lots of different nationalities at the school. And I think Thailand is always kind of seen as somewhere that has more of a fluid idea of gender. And so I think sometimes people kind of can misunderstand that means sexuality is kind of open and acceptable and things like that here, when actually I think it's very different for our Thai students compared to maybe some of our Western students. So I think also that that's an important area to consider when we're having these conversations, because, you know, school is here, but then they have families that they go home to, and things might be quite different in that context. So it's just to kind of understand and be sensitive to that.
Well, yeah, so that leads to the comment I wanted to mention, somebody's reference with the cultural context of the community or the country that the school is in. Obviously, we're here representing a swathe of international schools. And we've had this issue come up when we've been talking about things like racial awareness conversations as well. You know, what happens if the culture of the country that the school is in is not, quote unquote, ready for the conversation? What is our role? How do we make sure that we can be educating the community, and what do we do when we come up against resistance?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And it's one that I get all the time. And I'm very fortunate and privileged to have worked in 7 different countries and sort of had that experience firsthand. And what I would say is, number one, never underestimate the power of your school community, because I do think that, I've worked in countries where folks would think, oh, or, I had friends and family reach out when I was first moving there and said, isn't that going to be dangerous for you as a lesbian? And that country, in many ways, be a safer space for me as a lesbian than my home country of the US. So I think sometimes we also make assumptions about places and people and reactions, and we need to check that, because to be honest with you, I think sometimes, well, we always need to check our assumptions. But if leadership is on board and they want that conversation to happen and they mean what their mission statement says, and, again, let me know in the chat if your mission statement says something about globally minded, open-minded, understanding of others, this is what we're talking about. And if we're going to have these conversations and your mission statement says something about challenging students, this is what we mean. If your mission statement is just word salad, then okay, don't have these conversations. But if you really mean those words, you are going to say, we're going to have some conversations that we know are important, are relevant. And I would also say, when we're talking about students being so-called future ready and going into the workplace where they're going to work with a whole spectrum of people, this is what that also means, that they have the language, they have the terminology, and they also have that understanding of self. Because another misconception that I hear sometimes is, oh, these conversations are just for the gay kids. No, it's not, and also if we have a more broader or a more evolved understanding of sex, gender, and sexuality, we recognize, as Sadie said earlier, it's not binary, it's on a spectrum, and it can change over time. So we don't know which kids are necessarily the so-called gay kids, but even if your child is heterosexual now and forever, don't you want them to have an awareness of the world? Don't you want them to be able to work with, to coexist peacefully with others? And I would also just point out, sometimes we talk about having these conversations and being respectful of host countries. And I think sometimes that also comes from, a misconception that this is just about the Western world, which it isn't. And I think, digging into that and learning that gay people, trans people, all queer people have existed in all times across history, all around the world, and having that understanding. And I just sort of had a few books ready that I wanted to shout out in part of this conversation. So Samra Habib's We Have Always Been There, We Have Always Been Here is a great memoir, because I think when we're talking about intersectionality and the voices that get heard, if you ask folks to, tell me about a queer person who's well known, often it's going to be a white person, and often it's going to be somebody from a Western country. And so thinking about, well, why is it that they get privileged? And, just broadening our understanding of queer people are everywhere, and they have always been here is such an important conversation to have.
Yes, thank you. I'm interested to hear from Sadie too on your work in wellness, and I know that that's something that we'll come to when we talk about your context and your work that you're doing now in your school. But the conversation being for everyone, and for as part of our development in creating future ready learners who are peacefully coexisting with others. I think have you been able to frame that as part of a wellness conversation, as part of a right of the child conversation in any context you've worked in? I'd be interested to know where that overlaps for you.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's just kind of something that I've delved more and more into as I kind of started a wellbeing blog and newsletter. I kind of started it and was thinking about wellbeing existed in this vacuum, and I could just talk about the components of mental health and all those kind of things. And then I think for myself, going through this journey, I realized more and more how all these different things have impacted my wellbeing. So it's a journey that I'm on at the minute, and I think I guess I haven't found a way to frame it in a formalized way, but we've kind of started different peer groups that we've got older students helping us to have open forums to discuss different topics. And they might be around gender and sexuality, or they might be about other kind of issues. So I think they are just run by the school counsellors, so without the teachers there, and they're often kind of co-run with some of the older students. And I think just having a space where students can ask questions to us, to each other, and just reflect on things, and actually just kind of not have fear of saying their opinions or their understandings, and not being afraid to get things wrong, and us not being afraid to get things wrong, I think is a kind of best thing. I can't think of it as a framework as such, as more of a creation of a space.
And that's perhaps a really good segue into our next question, because I think Tricia mentioned earlier that schools should be the place for us to do these and have these conversations. But I also strongly believe that there should be a place that helps us understand our intersecting identities, and help us feel a sense of self-worth, and to be able to really thrive. And you'll hear these types of things in a lot of people's missions in schools, and well-being being one of their biggest targets, or an initiative, and something that's in their strategic development plan. But in order to achieve this, we have to recognize that that valuing and recognizing everybody's individual identities and the complexity of our identities is an inherent part of our feelings of self-worth, and our feelings of and that is really going to be a foundation in order for us to also be ready to learn, right? And learning is at the heart of what we're trying to do in all our educational institutions. And so we were also wondering if you could share with us, and Sadie, you mentioned you're on your journey right now, and I value you vulnerably sharing that with us right now as well. So maybe I'll just direct this at you, Tricia, is as how has or does your intersecting identity perhaps created advantages or disadvantages for you, perhaps throughout your schooling, or as a educator professional?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think the reality for me has been, when I first started working in schools, I was not out. I was very much afraid to be out. And then sort of the first time I was like dipping my toes into that, I had some really hard conversations with my school leadership at the time, who were very, very concerned about parent perception, about what people would say, and I mention this because I think school leaders, really think about the words that you want to use with your staff, and, also just have that awareness of, if that's truly how you feel, maybe think about being really blunt with that in your hiring. And schools who want to have, to do recruitment and to have kind of a true representation of the world's population, or to make sure that students are coming across folks who are different, so that they are, again, I love framing this from that sense of well-being, so that we can think about the way that we all coexist with different folks. Be really open with that in your recruitment, and in your wordage as well. So when I think about the fact that I spent a few years not being out, having to, or feel like I had to hide that, I kind of laugh when I say this. The other reality is, some folks, this is so funny. This happened just a few days ago, where my wife and I were doing some gardening outside. Of course, where we live in British Columbia, you can't have folks from outside your household in right now. And there were some folks walking by through the gate. They had a dog. We have our puppy. And so they were just kind of chatting with us about the dogs, and they said, "Oh, are the two of you twins?" And I should mention, my wife and I look nothing alike. She's half Chinese. She's quite a bit slimmer than I am. And so it's just really interesting for me to think, wow, like the first thought that comes to your brain is not two women living together. Maybe they're a couple or married, but that they must be twins. They don't look anything alike. I've also been asked if I am my wife's mother. So just the idea that okay, obviously I don't come across, or I don't present as being openly gay, which I laugh at, because the other thing that I hear all the time is, you're the spitting image of Ellen DeGeneres. I get that all the time. But then, whenever I'm seen in a context, which I think, obviously this is my partner, that's never folks' first response. It's always, are you her mother? My wife is 2 years younger than me. No, I'm not. That also doesn't make sense. But I'm rambling just to the point of, okay, so I was not out when I first started working. I had a lot of fear around that. And I also had some internalized homophobia. I felt like if I were out, am I creating a problem for the school? Is my gayness, is my queerness someone else's issue that I should feel guilty about? Interesting. When we talk about creating advantages, though, I think once I was out, in terms of it empowering me to realize, okay, I've already done a really hard thing. Some of the other hard things that we have to do in education felt, I don't know, like a little bit easier. And then once I became a little bit more outspoken about what it means to be one of the few queer educators in my community, and I say that, we've been talking about international education. There's not a whole lot of us, right? I think then it kind of gave me the opportunity for folks to want to have more conversations. But I literally had to say at a Learning to talk in a conference in front of hundreds of people, hey, ask more questions about this. Because I talked about in the recruitment process, when my wife and I would be interviewing, I would always ask, what would it be like for a queer couple at your school? And I was often told, why would you even ask that? It's 2012, 2014, whatever. Of course it's fine. And then it dawned on me later, these school leaders are saying this to me, but they have no idea. They have no actual idea. So, again, I think the advantage that it created once I started talking about what it's like to be queer in the world of education, it did help start some conversations. But I think the disadvantage is I really had to just sort of do the work of saying, we need these conversations, where it would be great if it were not always the queer people saying, we need to have these conversations.
Thank you so much for sharing your journey and your personal story with that, and it goes to show, I think I'm just picking up on some of the chat that's here, that there's so much work that is ahead of us, and so much work that it needs to be done in order for us to learn at all ages, in order to, because the stories you shared highlights, I think, the centering on this kind of heteronormative cultural norm that we live in, and that it's very global, and that message is so strong that people can't think of alternative views to a story of seeing you and your partner together, you and your wife together, that their brain is kind of like searching for meaning and attaching what they know. So if what they know happens to be Ellen, then that's where they're at in their learning and journey, and so there's a lot that we can, that us as educators of schools, and with the power that we have to help people with that journey of learning and becoming, have the language in order to be able to do that, and the strategies that we can hopefully all develop together and build on, which I know is a lot of your work, Tricia and Sadie, as well, that you've been doing in your school. So thank you for sharing that story. So I think, we've talked a little bit about this already. What are your thoughts, Kyra?
Yeah, I just skip forward to the next slide because you were leading us there anyway. We've had a couple of comments about differences about being out as a woman and out as a man, and that there has been an ease, maybe not an ease, but there's more openly queer male teachers that this educator has worked with than female. Is that a symptom of what we're talking about in terms of the identities that are more permissive, more allowed? Is there a cross-section holding queer female educators back from being able to be who they are at work? And is this part of the larger discussion that we need to be having about heteronormative views? So I think we're already there. Let's get into it.
Yeah, I just wanted to add. I thought it was really interesting, Tricia, what you said about kind of you and your wife, like someone else walking by and asking if you were twins. I have that all the time with my wife. Are you sisters? Are you twins? And it's the thing that I fear the most, actually, is having to correct that and then feeling bad for them making the mistake. Which I think is definitely something I dread. I've had a quite an interesting experience that is very different to Tricia's. I'm in my first school, so I can't talk from any other experiences or from any other schools, but I was kind of outed when I came to the school. I worked with my wife. She was already working there. One of the students asked her one day, like, Miss, I've got a good gaydar. Are you gay? And she didn't know what to say. And then she said, yeah. And then from then, it just kind of naturally dispersed. And from then on, she was kind of out. And so when I joined, I was already known as her wife. And actually, I feel that that's helped me a lot. I guess not to feel comfortable with it, but to avoid a lot of difficult conversations. I never had to come out. I already was out when I joined. And I think what I've kind of maybe slightly intentionally done as well with the blog that I'm writing is to write articles about sexuality and coming out, for the hope that when I do move on, I'm kind of hoping to signpost the prospective employers to that, so I don't have to go through that process again, because that's quite an awkward process that I have to identify myself to them rather than just accepting that who I am or not even have to say anything. So yeah, just kind of a very different experience to Tricia in that sense.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I saw Tricia nodding at the question I asked about the ability or the role models that queer female educators may have in front of them, how blazed that path already is. Why did I see you nodding? What were you thinking about when the question came forward in the chat about having more openly queer or gay male colleagues in leadership positions and how that's affecting, I guess, the structures that exist for female educators? Because I think we have to address that from the WomenEd perspective too.
Well, I was just thinking about the standard that women are asked to live up to all the time, and how, it's a little bit cliche to say, if you're going to be a woman in leadership, you have to be perfect because you are just under so much more scrutiny. And I've done a lot of reflecting on, how I have done that with women in leadership that I have worked with, how even I feel like I've held them to a different standard. So it's sort of like, if a male boss were being grumpy with me one day, I'd probably just shrug it off and be like, oh, probably having a bad day. But if a woman in leadership did that, I would think like, how can she behave that way? That's so rude. And that even as a woman, sometimes we just don't give one another that space for the casual imperfections, I would say. And so, I just kind of think there's already a different standard, I think, for women, not just in leadership, but, I kind of think even just socially out in public, we are often expected to be warmer, to be, the ones who are permissive, are kinder. I think there's a lot of just soft skills that are asked of women that are not necessarily always asked of men. And I think then when you layer it on top of, if you identify as queer, it's sort of okay, well, you're already a woman, there's a strike, and you're going to be a different kind of woman. So I think, my wife and I were having this conversation recently where we had a fence installed. We paid a good amount of money for this gate. And the person who designed it had kind of changed the design on us last minute and installed it. And it wasn't actually what we paid for. And so we were debating, like, do we say something because we're women and we're lesbians? So is it well, I already think, and excuse my language, you're being a bitch. And are you being an extra bitch because you're lesbians? And I kind of think, there is that assumption that, like, you're a woman, so if you bring up a problem, hey, women aren't supposed to bring up problems. And do you feel empowered to bring up this problem because you're lesbians, and lesbians are even harsher women? And I kind of just think there's that assumption sometimes. And the moral of the story is actually we did decide, and my wife is such a brave person. She was like, I'm not letting this go. We paid money, we asked for a specific design, and you know what, if he thinks that of us, I don't care. Like we have to sort of assert ourselves, or almost like rehearse asserting ourselves sometimes. Otherwise you'll never be able to stand up for the bigger issues. So I think standards of women, I don't know if this is changing. I'm glad that we're having more conversations about women in leadership, but I still do think I often hear that kind of water cooler talk of, that she has to be perfect. She has to be flawless. And I think kind of the standard for men, you can be a good guy quite easily. And I often ask people, what is the female equivalent for good guy? Because you hear lots of folks all the time, he's a good guy, he's a good guy. What did he do? Often it's, he didn't do anything bad. What is the equivalent for women?
Yeah, and in the communities that you're engaging with, you're interacting with through your networks, both of you have, blogs and you have a podcast, Tricia, which has been running for a while. What have you found? And maybe this will lead us forward into the next slide as we're coming to the last 10 minutes. But some examples of best practice in this space, then some examples of actionable things, conversations that have changed or helped to introduce new ways of interacting around the water cooler, or new ways of talking about leadership, or helping women who are in the space get further and trailblaze for others. Have you had any good experiences you'd like to highlight so that the educators here can take notes, take heart, and contact you about them?
Just recently on the podcast, a number of folks came on to share their experiences in terms of what it means to have difficult conversations, and what it means to reframe a so-called difficult conversation as a necessary one. And that's, again, I don't know how much space we have made in schools for helping students engage in difficult conversations. And I think we're really misleading our young learners if we are setting them up to only be able to have conversations that are easy, because I think some of the most important conversations that we have to have are the ones that are going to be a little bit uncomfortable, a little bit unsettling. And so in that series, folks kind of reflected on what's made it a little bit easier for them to have so-called difficult conversations. And, in the example that I just gave, my wife is also a new vice principal. And I think, of that gate situation, you have to get comfortable almost rehearsing having some of those micro difficult conversations in order to have the bigger one. So, I would say schools really need to ask, what are we doing to teach our young learners in terms of having that skill set that enables them to have uncomfortable, necessary conversations? And within our own staff, within our own meetings, our team meetings, our faculty, our workshops, do we see that mirrored? Or do we constantly have almost this default mode to alignment and agreement? Because if you do, I know that on the surface, folks can think, what a great community, we all agree with each other. No, that's not the reality of what's happening. That means that folks feel kind of silenced. So asking that question of how are we provoking, how are we engaging with more difficult conversations, and how are we working on that skill set? And I think a big part of that is, Sadie, you pointed out that level of discomfort is there because folks are worried they might be wrong. Guess what? We might be wrong about an awful lot of things, and we have been wrong about an awful lot of things. So what if instead of, being afraid of it, we just sort of made a space for it, and that was part of our conversation norms? Why might I be wrong here?
I think you bring up a very good point about the importance of having these safe spaces to have conversations, and above all, and I think what should shift and be valued more than agreement and harmony is actually the capacity for people to have rich dialogue, to argue, to look at different perspectives, and to identify where their stance is within this, and then to think that and to respect other people's differences. This is like, part of the IB mission that, we respect other people's differences to always be right, but do we actually understand what that means in order to treat different people with dignity, even though they may have very opposing views than us? And I think that, and so that an example that's come up in the chat from Efua is that, she like, it's just an example of the conversation piece, is that she says that, or he or she says that if someone asks me a question and if I do not want to answer, I always respond, curious to know, why do you ask? I get the question of, you are a certain age, why are not married with kids? And I respond, then when how you respond and how you're able to shape that conversation may help them reframe the question. And just from that part of someone else reframing that question is them reflecting on their assumptions and being able to question their assumptions and to think about, oh, well, maybe I've thought very narrowly about how this and other people's identities and in terms of my own, and instead of valuing the different realities of of different intersectional existences, that is a fact, that it's out there as well. Yeah. So thank you. What are perhaps some other examples that you can maybe highlight for us, Sadie? Like, I think there was a question previously about, maybe is there something that you started in your school that is had, you mentioned a little bit about the conversations that, and the bringing the older kids together with the younger kids. Is there an actual program that you've put into your school that you could share with us?
There was a question about comprehensive sexuality education in your school specifically. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think like that's kind of delivered through our PSHE program, but the groups that we run, I'm not sure we've quite got it right, but we've been doing it in discussion. Like, it is kind of a formalized thing where we have we've got a boys and a girls group, but the boys and girls group are those that identify as male or those that identify as female. This was from a discussion with the students where we asked them, how should we have these discussions? In what spaces would you feel most comfortable doing it? And they said, sometimes we would like to have discussions that are mixed, and some things we feel like it would be a safer space if we allowed at times to have spaces that were female identifying students. So we've worked with both, but we've made sure it's kind of clear to all students that it's how you identify. And we've also made sure that we've got kind of a diversity forum that allows us to talk about all things. I appreciate this is a real difficult thing because we're not sure what the right thing is, but we're definitely trying to play around with that and getting students to reflect, and are kind of, as well as us reflecting on how those conversations go and if they were best addressed or kind of brought up in that way.
Sadie, I feel like there's so much power in that statement alone. Like, and I almost wish more schools operated from that space of, I think what you said was, we're not quite right, that we've got it correct. And I think that's a much better default than, unfortunately, I feel like I see and hear a lot of schools be like, everything is fine here. There's no issues. There's no problems. And I think if we could operate more from that space of, hey, this might not quite be the ideal situation that we want to create yet, then we're always working on learning and unlearning.
Yeah. So we've been kind of hopefully the audience is feeling that we've been addressing some of your questions along the way. But if you have one that perhaps we've missed that you maybe want to repost here at the beginning of the chat, or to ask some as well. And thank you, Miranda, for sharing the example that of what you're doing in your school as well in Warsaw. I think that's also great. And there's a lot of different educators who have different experiences and stories in which they can share. And I hope that we're able to continue these conversations as well. This is just the beginning, and a small part of that. So yeah, and Susie is just sharing with us that how asking students how they would like to learn in comprehensive sexuality education is really important, and I hope that people will walk away with that message today as well. So I think, Kyra, do we have some time for I'm seeing some question. Yeah, so I think that we'd like to wrap up, and maybe if you could go to the slide before.
Sorry, yeah. We're going to ask people to take with their own takeaways, but yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Sure. Yeah. And so just like to kind of end with a quote from Kimberly Crenshaw. That's she said that if we aren't intersectional, some of us, the most vulnerable, are going to fall through the cracks. And I think that that is very true, and we've explored stories of how that has happened. And so we want to thank Sadie and Tricia for highlighting that for us. And this is just, I guess, the beginning I've learned a lot. Thank you so much. And I must admit, I was a bit nervous coming into this, that I wouldn't say anything that was like on PC but we're all on this, and to have these conversations and to be able to do that. So I'd like you to walk away with some of these reflections to think about, are your actions promoting intersectional equity, or perhaps perpetuating inequity, whether it be conscious or subconscious? And by kind of hanging on to like a cultural norm that you may or may not be aware of. So these reflection questions, I hope you'll walk away with, to think about maybe what part are you playing in upholding a singular cultural norm, or part of recognizing and valuing intersectionalities, and perhaps what will you do, whether it be this afternoon, tomorrow, or in a week, or in a medium or long-term plan in your school.
Yes, finally, I think I just wanted to get to the slide that I will explain that there's a lot here that we have collated with the help of Sadie and Tricia, and we will make sure that this, as I said, is a presentation shared on the WomenEd YouTube channel, so you can go back and access it. We'll also ask Jo Whitson, who's here representing ECIS, to ensure that these resources are posted on the ECIS WomenEd collaboration page on their website, so that you can go back and access some of these great resources compiled by our panelists today. So we'll make sure that we can support you in some of those conversations you're going to take back to your schools, and really heartened to see that some of you are already undertaking great work in terms of forming allyship groups within your cities and locales as well. And thank you all for the time you've spent with us this lunchtime. I hope it's been a good and important start to the conversation in your own settings.
And I do want to also thank Jo from ECIS, who supports us on the back end of these to make these webinars happen. And she's also highlighted for us in the chat that the ECIS Leadership Conference this year is virtual, and it's on in April. And the theme for it this year is diversity and belonging, the power of commonality and inclusion. And there were some session proposals there related to this topic as well. And so do think about having a look at the program and joining us there as well. So thank you, and thank you so much, Tricia, for your very early start
Yes.
and joining us for this, and Sadie for your evening there in Thailand as well. Yeah, so thank you very much, and thank you to everyone who joined us today.
Yes, and we'll see you tuned for the next session of the Heart to Heart series. Will be in March, early March, with a special He for She event. We will be celebrating International Women's Day from a slightly alternative perspective. So hopefully you'll join us for the next one in the session in a couple of months' time. Thank you again to Tricia and Sadie for your time and your expertise, and for your vulnerability with us today as well.
Thank you so much for making space for this conversation and for inviting me. I really appreciate it. Really an honor. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Really nice to speak to you all. Thank you.